Hello, and thanks for clicking on Very British Futures. I'm Gareth Preston, and each episode I'm looking at a British science fiction series from the archives. Today is our first look at a programme from the 90s, ITV's alien conspiracy miniseries, The Uninvited. Joining me to talk about paranoia, eerie white eyes and cosy catastrophes are two friends of mine, John Isles and Nikki Smalley. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Hello.
John Isles is a writer, director, producer and occasional actor, as one part of an amateur short filmmaking team that has won several awards. He has written solo and co-written with Charles Octoloni short stories published by Big Finish. Nikki Smalley is a software engineer for the DWP and an actor, performing in theatre and appearing on both UK and US television. The Uninvited was broadcast on ITV in 1997 in 4 episodes. The initial idea came from Leslie Grantham, who originally proposed it as an ongoing series to the BBC. Eventually it moved to ITV and was reworked as a self-contained miniseries. It was written by Peter Boker, a busy television writer with credits from Casualty to Eric and Ernie to his current success of The A Word. Equally well-experienced television veteran Norman Stone directed. The most notable telefantasy name on the credits belonged to producer Ruth Boswell, who also produced Shadows and The Tomorrow People, along with script editing Time Slip and Escape into Night. The series is available on DVD and was released in 2003 by Carlton. So, John, how would you pitch the plot of The Uninvited to someone who hasn't seen it?
Well, Leslie Grantham had a dream. So he said that I have a vague memory of seeing something on like TV AM or something like that, an interview with him, a little behind the scenes. Not sure if I dreamt that or not myself. But essentially, his idea was from this village that had really disappeared off the coast into the sea, erosion, that kind of thing. So his idea was, what could cause a village to sink into the sea, and what if all the people in that village survived? Why would that happen? And so from that, he had the idea of, they've been replaced. And from there, you've got something that's a kind of conspiracy thriller. Have the people been replaced? Have their experiences changed them? Are they the same people? And took it from there, really.
So we enter the story on the fictional point of a retired photojournalist
Yes.
called Steve Blake.
That's right. He sees a car crash. He sees the driver before it happens. The car explodes in a fireball, and he goes to see the guy's widow the next day and finds him alive and well. And he also happens to be the head of British nuclear power, slightly. So the question is this some sort of powerful elite? Because this and similar accidents are being investigated by a high-ranking, shadowy police superintendent who just happens to be one of the survivors from this village that mysteriously vanished into the sea.
Mm-hmm.
Who's played by Leslie Grantham, who has his reputation, I guess, of being a hard man from playing Dirty Dan and other characters.
Well, he regularly plays villains, doesn't he?
There's no doubt Dirty Den did sort of typecast it. He tried to kind of break out of it a bit and play characters who were at least, they were just, they weren't bad. They were just a little bit tasty, But
Well, he wanted to be Blake, didn't he? In Uninvited, he wanted to be the hero character, but obviously ITV or well, he could have even been back when it was still. They just decided he'd be better as the villain, so he had to go with that.
Perhaps he was considered too old to be the lead in this kind of, well, I was going to say action, but it's a thriller.
Yeah, there is action in it, But it is possible ITV thought he was just too old, or perhaps too well established, playing sinister characters
That's true.
For the audience to get behind him. Because what's interesting is that when it was originally proposed, it was much more in the mold of The Invaders, the US 60s TV series.
I was going to bring that up later, but you're right. It is that embedded in the system, because the survivors of a village have become MPs. They're on boards of businesses and other high-profile roles in society, aren't they?
I'm actually quite pleased that it didn't go down that path, because the trouble with The Invaders and similar things is that
They never ended.
exactly they can quickly become a bit repetitive, because the one thing the hero can't do is sort of prove his case and expose the aliens, because that's the end of the series if he does that. And it's one of the reasons I'm not actually that fond of The Invaders, despite it has good qualities. It's got Roy Finnis, it's got terrific music and mood, and I like the little gimmicks like in fact, yes, but we might move on to this a little later on about the aliens in this series have relatively little in the way of gimmicks.
Whereas Invaders, they had a little finger stuck out permanently, didn't they?
That was it. That was the bit you were waiting to see.
But if you walked around with a teacup and saucer all the time, you'd never know.
With Birch and that, you do get that feeling that maybe it's a bit early to talk about, I don't know, but the aliens, and because there's nothing obviously alien about them, they feel a bit underdeveloped story-wise. I know because I'd never seen The Uninvited the first time round, and in fact, until you mentioned it, I'd actually not heard of it before, which I was quite surprised about. And when I watched it, by the time I got to the end, and I thought, I'm not quite sure what the old aliens were about. I have any idea what they want, because I mean the story is not new. It is, like you said, The Invaders or Invasion of Body Snatchers. It's been done before, but the aliens themselves, I weren't quite sure what they were like, or I couldn't try and imagine what they were like.
It is striking that after 4 episodes, the aliens are still pretty mysterious. There's lots of questions, and you can either take that as enigmatic or you can describe it as underdeveloped.
I think it's a bit of both, because I think in some ways they're trying to create atmosphere, aren't they? By sort of, I mean, they set up how it's like, is this a human conspiracy? Is Steve Blake going nuts? It's kind of slightly trying to be ambiguous, but I think we find out in the first episode that there is something up, and it can't be just humans, can it? From all the publicity, I mean, Leslie Grantham is the face of the series. He's on the DVD cover, he's on the book cover, it's him with the white eyes, so despite being like co-lead or third billing, he's all over it. I don't know if that's his ego making up for not playing the lead, but and from what I recall of the trailers, because this is quite a while now, I'm sure a white-eyed shot must have been in the trailers. Do you remember at all, Gareth?
I can't actually remember a trailer for it. I did watch it at the time, because I remember there was a feature on it in, I think it was the Radio Times, and it was kind of, ITV is making a big investment in drama this autumn, and we've got all these, and it was about 4 big drama series starting at the same time, and The Uninvited was the one I noticed because it was the science fiction one.
Well, of course we grabbed onto whatever we could in the wilderness years, didn't we?
We did, and in fact,
even Crime Traveller.
Even Crime Traveller. We shall move on to thinking about the so-called. Well, if you're a Doctor Who fan,
I know. I'm sorry, just
years.
that's how it is.
But I think it is a question. We'll come to it a little later on about the whole what the 90s were like for British science fiction. Going back to the aliens, it's interesting that we don't really, for a start, we don't even really know if they've come from another planet, or if they've somehow they've been buried somewhere in the earth and they've been reawakened.
Well, we find out that they're from an environment similar to prehistoric Earth, with high levels of carbon, low level of oxygen. And so the characters, we see someone carrying around these inhalers that I presume have carbon in them, rather than carbon dioxide, I should say, because our oxygen's too much for them. The bit where Blake and Melissa, I think specifically, she goes to visit one of the survivors, who's an old lady with Alzheimer's, who was also replaced. And so when she was copied, she had the Alzheimer's, and so her alien has got mixed up memories and doesn't know if she's a human or an alien. And she talks about, we can't breathe your air or share your air, something like that. And obviously, if we go further on to the end of it, when they sabotage, they do a Chernobyl on most of the world's nuclear power stations, they want to turn the planet's atmosphere into their own. They're thriving off the fact that we've reached this global warming stage or whatever, where we're polluting our air deliberately, so it's perfect for them to come and take over. Yeah, I suppose a bit of social commentary there.
And of course, well, that's also how, leading on from that, that's how it ends as well, in the sense of Blake smashes the pipe and blows all that oxygen in the faces, which kills them all.
What's interesting is that in 1995, they had tried to bring back The Invaders, revive it with Scott Bakula in the lead. And the general overall theme of that is that the aliens were trying to poison the atmosphere and are trying to create more pollution to make it more like their planet, which is a curious parallel line there.
Was it the 90s when we became more aware of global warming then?
I think that could have been the case that the writers, they were pulling from drawing from the same well on that. Yeah. The other element that the Uninvited is very much in the tradition of is John Wyndham and a whole stream of kind of English science fiction. I was wondering, Nikki, if you'd had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I did. I mean, obviously, anything like that, even to some degree, Invasion of Body Snatchers and whatever, you get that Midwich Cuckoos vibe, I think. And I mean, also, it's quite interesting, The Uninvited, in the sense that you have that Midwich Cuckoo feeling of this little village, but you never actually see it because it's already destroyed. But you've already got that mental image in your head. I think of Sweet Hope and what it must have been like. But obviously, this is 5 years down the line when the aliens have moved on and the plan's already in motion. But what I like about stuff like that is England is the best setting for it. Like America's done their own version of Village of the Damned and stuff like that. And obviously they have countrified areas, but they're always large areas with ranches or farms and large bits of land that you can see. Where in England, it tends to be a little village in the middle of nowhere with one road in and one road out, and all the buildings in the town create that claustrophobic atmosphere that really lends well to these type of things. But again, The Uninvited is sort of, it's different because you only picture that in your mind, and then instead you get these beautiful beach coastal scenes instead, and then a mixture as well of the London city. But yeah, very very much in the vein of John Wyndham and anything like that, because it's got that atmosphere that it's your little town, your little village, you're closed off from everywhere, and then suddenly aliens have invaded, and it's all going very strange. Yeah, great.
No, I was going to say, I remember there was an article in TV Zone at the time, and Leslie Grantham said that they were trying to tell a good story, which was basically a good B movie, but you know, a quality B movie, and to some extent that is because people do, I suppose they still do think of Invasion of Body Snatchers or Village of the Damned as a B movie, don't they? Or even Quatermass to some extent, Quatermass 2, but then again, you know, was Nigel Neal riffing off John Wyndham.
Yeah, I think John Wyndham's influence on British science fiction is gigantic. It's for Britain, I think it's a bit like Isaac Asimov in America in terms of the influence that he's had over other writers and bringing the strange sort of into present day conventional England.
Yes.
And, well, in many of his books, The Day of the Triffids is the most famous one, obviously, and The Crack of Wakes. Chucky is a good example, and The Crack and Wakes, which are all these where Middle England gets invaded by something unreasonable and alien.
This is something that I noted. So the main character, the hero, is an ex-photojournalist, so he's a professional. Roy Finnis in The Invaders is an architect, and I just wondered how in most things the lead character is a professional of some kind. And I just wondered, is that to reflect the middle class nature of all the writers of all these things, or is it just that it has to be somebody that is respectable who you think would be believed about there are aliens amongst us?
I think it's a bit of a mixture of both things, and certainly I think there is a part. And weirdly, I was just having this discussion earlier on today in a wider context about how middle class or not television is, British television.
Like Nines.
And I think part of it is that a lot of the people who work in television are middle class. So their minds naturally go in that way of, as you say, professionals. And
Yeah, plus I can't think of many working class heroes in thrillers or science fiction, really.
It's true. It's hard to imagine.
Alien?
You can certainly imagine aliens coming in. That's not a great stretch to see aliens in a working class environment. But yeah, there is that element of, you know, if it was a postman or, you know, some skilled factory worker who was aware of this conspiracy, you know, he wouldn't even get through the door of most of these places.
Maybe that's why they had to be working professionals or middle class then, so they can at least be heard or dismissed by the experts.
Yeah, sorry, I was just thinking another reason I always thought that they always chose middle class or professional people is that if you assume someone's professional, you presume they're earning some kind of reasonable income. And if someone can go off all the time and do X, Y, and Z, like jump on a train down to London and spend a week there because they're investigating something or whatever, I think it's that thing of, would anyone question if you got someone on a low-skilled job who's perhaps getting low money, where they're getting the money from to travel here or whatever? It cuts all that questioning out and just it allows the story to just carry on because you don't. It's. I know it sounds a daft thing, but it's like people might question that. Whereas if you go, oh well, he's a photographer, he's probably got a fair bit in bank. That's why he can have his time off and not work and jump up and down the country every 2 minutes.
So we need to pitch a sci-fi conspiracy thriller where the hero is an Ebby Stobart truck driver.
That would be a good choice.
So he can travel, Nicky. You know, no questions.
I was just thinking that you'll compare it to Close Encounters of the Third Kind film.
He's working class, isn't he?
He's working class. And what happens to him when he starts chasing aliens and UFOs? He loses his job within a few days. He's unemployed at it, and because he's a family man, it also brings chaos to his family and his family leaving. Whereas a lot of the protagonists in this kind of show tend to be loners or unattached, as in the case here with Steve, where he doesn't have any children. He's got an ex who actually turns out to be an incredibly useful ex-wife because she's a newspaper editor, and is a very handy way of getting our hero into places. Actually, I think I should say, usually I start off by saying, when did you first encounter the uninvited? But in this case, it's a case of you both really watched it at my instigation.
No.
Oh,
I watched it
no.
at the time. I had it on video.
Ah,
I recorded it and had it on tape for many years until I had to sadly dispose of my VHS tapes.
that's interesting. Because funnily enough, I taped it on video too. I think it goes back to that thing that there wasn't that much science fiction about.
No,
So
it wasn't quite like wishing that I'd like it. I did genuinely like it, and I still do. But there's still something that's slightly underwhelming about it, and I can't quite figure out what. Maybe it's because there's not enough mood or atmosphere. Maybe it's because we know from the beginning it definitely is aliens, and it's not as ambiguous to us as a viewer as it is to the characters.
to some extent.
Sorry, go on.
Sorry, no, I was going to say, carry on, Nikki.
I was just going to say, I think the trouble with it is, as we said near the beginning, is that clearly Leslie Grantham had a bigger plan in mind, and then it's forced into these 4 episodes. So there's like a rushed element to it, and when you actually think about the plot elements, there's parts that really fall down. Like obviously the Sweet Hope. Start again. So like Sweet Hope falls into the sea, and what you discover throughout the in the story is that these aliens somehow got the villagers of Sweet Hope into a church before they sunk it, and then however they take over the bodies is well, they don't take over the bodies because the bodies are still there, but they clone the bodies and the minds, and that church has gone into the sea. But then it's left there, and they're constantly persuading people to stay away from the sea because clearly they don't want anyone to discover it. But then Blake sneaks down there, takes the photos of the dead bodies in the church, and then suddenly they start blowing it up, and you just sort of think, why didn't you do this 5 years ago?
I think it might have been booby trapped because they said the initial explosion and the erosion that caused Sweet Hope to fall into the sea in the first place was from some unknown MOD ordnance dumped after the war. But that could have been a cover for what happened, or also there genuinely were explosives. But then, it's a reason for people not to go down and investigate. And I think they just left a booby trap. So if anyone like Steve Blake went down there, then they'd never get away with any evidence.
Yeah, I quite like that idea.
Plus, it's some really good imagery as well. The skeletons in the church all gathered together.
Yeah, well, I mean, he does need that scene because it's quite atmospheric. Where he's under the water, it's quite misty, and he discovers the bodies, and the penny starts dropping for him, even though he doesn't still quite believe it's aliens at that point. But he accepts that what's happened is extremely sinister, and somehow these people have been replaced in some way. There was some other bits as well that I thought, because clearly he's not the first journalist to have investigated this either, because Grant actually says to him at one point, oh, you people always get to that bit, as if like he's been asked about Sweet Hope before by journalists. But
yeah.
But then you assume then that these journalists have either been maybe renewed. We don't know. We've never seen a renewed journalist, and I don't know if there'd necessarily be a point for it. Whether they've been killed or swayed off in some other way. But then they allow Blake to carry on, and it's not quite explicit, but you're assuming that, or I assumed by the end of it, that the reason they allow Blake to continue is because they're well on the way with the plan and they're wanting a patsy, and they're making the patsy. But it just didn't quite flow well for me as I watched it. I kept thinking, well, if they've had all these people before, why him? Why specifically him compared to anyone else they've had before? And and some of the things where they sort of let it slide, and then other ways I don't like you mentioned the old lady with Alzheimer's, which actually I thought were a really interesting idea. Actually, the idea that this alien has copied the mind of a person with Alzheimer's, and as a result, it's captured their personality. But they end up killing that character because they're afraid she's going to say something. But you've got to argue who's going to believe a batty old lady
Well,
in a nursing home talking about aliens.
Steve
You know,
Blake.
well, Steve Blake, but what does it really matter? Do you know what I mean? Because they know they're going to make him some kind of patsy anyway, and he's never going to get any evidence out of her really that's going to break it all open. Oh, that's how I felt when I watched it.
But you're right, Nicky. There isn't much point to them killing her other than the fact she's a slight risk. But maybe, and this is just convenience for storytelling, is by killing her, we're shown that they're all linked. So if something bad happens to one, it happens to them all.
Yeah.
Because when she dies, the others start having nosebleeds, spasms, and that gives our heroes the clue that that they're linked. So you're right. From a story point of view, it doesn't make much sense. It's just kind of there. But again, I really like the idea that they've copied the Alzheimer's and everything, so that the aliens controlling the alien intelligence in her body is fighting the Alzheimer's, and they are literally in two minds. And they are using Steve. They say they put like part of Gates puts part of his intelligence into Steve, so it's like he's bugged, so to speak, isn't he?
Yes.
So they know exactly where he is. And they use him to root out how far Melissa's getting with her investigation. You've got the pathologist, to find people who are a threat to them. But then again, you've got this secret military guy who is like, oh great, we've been watching the aliens, but then actually he is one of the aliens. I wonder, did he replace somebody who generally was onto them? And they're running their own investigation into themselves to run interference.
Yeah. One of the curious things about this replacing of people is that we never really find out much about it. So we don't know whether these aliens are like pod people that grown like that, or if these aliens are natural shape changers. I mean, we don't know if once an alien takes on a form, that's it. They're sort of stuck.
That's an interesting point, Gareth, because going back to the woman with Alzheimer's, if it were a case that they could renew into someone else, why do they not get her to renew? So you assume that it's a one-time deal for whatever reason.
Yeah, I think we can assume, thinking about it, that it is a one-time deal because you've got those two alien children as well.
They don't age, those children.
No.
Mysterious. And in fact, I slightly wondered, how do these two alien children spend their day? Are they going to school, or if it's a private school, are they behind the scenes? Are they just like doing all the adult? Are they there controlling stuff and operating the consoles, or are they behaving more like children? Are they really frustrated because they're stuck in these feeble little bodies?
Probably. I mean, in the novelization that goes into it a bit, I don't know how much of it.
Right.
I don't know how much of it was in the script or whether Paul Cornell that wrote it just extrapolated it himself. But he says in the novel that the aliens are a kind of gaseous form, so they don't have bodies of their own. And so these copies that they make at the time of killing the originals means that they copy the intelligence and the form with their own bit of intelligence shoved in there. And then they're kind of stuck in that body, then it's now theirs. And like you said, the children don't change at all. 5 years later, they're the same age. And maybe they just don't go to school because, and this is something you're probably going to bring up, is that their parents are now running the British equivalent of Microsoft. And so they can afford to not go to public school. And so they're never seen. And it's always assumed they're privately educated.
Yes, it's interesting, this depiction of a computer company.
Zentex.
Which sounds like something else, to be fair, doesn't it?
It does. It just feels like, yes. Yeah,
but it's interesting how we're kind of on the cusp here. 96, 97, it was shown of, we've got an internet cafe as if it's a novelty. And obviously there were novelties. I've used at least a couple of internet cafes at the time, so I can relate to that. But
I had a rush of nostalgia when they went into the internet cafe, because I remember those and going in those. I was never one of the gamers. I was sort of like those people who was playing Wolfenstein or Doom or whatever on but just using the internet and scanning it about, and that was a bit Proustian, that moment.
Can I just say, I actually got nostalgic seeing the Ford Sierra being used as a taxi.
Yes, it's funny how nostalgic you can get something that seems relatively feel. It doesn't. The 90s. This is probably a thing between old people like you and me, John.
It is. They still feel recent, don't they?
Yeah, it does. And plus, and it's not a chain coffee shop either. It's an indie coffee shop.
Independent,
yeah, that kind of tickled me. In fact, just looking at that software, that 90s software, actually felt quite, again, just quite nostalgic. It's like, oh yeah, sort of like the internet used to look like this.
Exactly. It's kind of DOS based still, with a little bit of a Windows element in it.
I like recently, I had a conversation with a colleague who's moving to another government department after 31 years, and she says she always remembers going to a training course which was called The Internet, What Is It and How Can We Use It in DWP? And that sort of really amused me, and they got a chance to use a computer and the internet, and she would just sat there thinking, what can I search for?
Yeah, Nikki, as a software, what was your job title again? Sorry.
I'm a software engineer.
So as a software engineer, how do the scenes of the hacking and the other software look to you? Is it believable for the mid-90s, or is it just too fantastical?
It's not believable then. It's not believable now, as often the case when they try to use IT in TV shows, with perhaps the exception of Mr. Robot. Yeah, I mean, the fact as well that he could only hack in 6-minute intervals.
Oh yeah.
And that really made me laugh, as if, that would somehow game anywhere. And how long would that take? Over, you might be at it for months, wouldn't you?
Well, yeah, I think it'd take him 3 minutes for the modem to dial up, wouldn't it?
Yeah, particularly as well the fact that it's software developed by aliens. So you've got, assuming they're alien,
yes,
and you assume that it's really advanced. You just think, God, he could have been at that forever until Steve Blake turned up. And even then, I'm not really sure how he got around it. But yeah, now it's ridiculous terminology as usual.
The other thing interesting looking at with that the whole Zentex episode is the head of Zentex. If you were doing that now, the default setting is now young tech billionaire.
Yes,
it's a bit like Elon Musk. Whereas in this version, in this earlier time, he's just a kind of grey-haired family man.
Eamon Boland played that character. A lot of guest star roles in lots of programs, very different 60s onwards.
I have to say, what I found about the show, since we're talking about cast members, is on the whole, I was quite happy with the cast and the performances, with exception, and I'm a bit disappointed at this, the 2 female leads. So I did like the pathologist. I thought she was really good.
Yes.
But his ex-wife, I just found her a bit too. I mean, I get it, obviously they're divorced and you've got to have that bitterness there, but she was a bit too harsh throughout the piece for me. And then when she eventually kisses him, you sort of think, well, where did that come from? Because fair enough, she's helping him, and you could argue that's her bit of warmth, that she's still got feelings for him, but it doesn't come across. And I did feel that Paul Cornell's book was excusing her a lot of the time. Like he would come up with a preamble of what she was thinking, and her head was all very nice, and then he'd say something like, but it came out a bit too sharp, and it was almost like the way she performed it. And then Leah Williams as Melissa. Obviously, she's supposed to be that librarian character, but again, she played the mousy librarian well, but I didn't really get the sexual tension that was supposed to be there that led up to them her Blake becoming a thing, it felt really underdone. But again, does it suffer from just being 4 episodes as opposed to a series, which it planned to be?
It's possible, but you're right. Melissa Leah Williams is a bit underwhelming. The strongest one is Caroline Lee Johnson as a pathologist, who was Lenny Henry's wife in Chef.
She is very good.
Remember that? She is.
Yeah.
In fact, you almost want to see more of that character.
Yeah.
In fact, she'd been Blake in terms of the story. If she'd like discovered the conspiracy through the pathology and then investigated, I think that
she's a professional.
Yeah, she's a professional.
That's true. I actually agree with you. I think that would have immediately made the series more interesting, because also she's got more to lose in a way, because she's got her standing, her professional, as a coroner and as a doctor. I think the stakes are a bit higher for her than they are for an independent photojournalist.
Well, the thing with Blake as well is that he's sort of already lost his career to an extent. He's had a good photojournalist career, and then he's had this mental health issue as a result of his time in Bosnia, and it's tarred him to some degree. But in saying that, I did like Douglas Hodges' performance in the role. It wasn't quite conventional when you look at him. Like when he first started, I thought, that's not quite what I imagined for a lead role. And I appreciate that in England, when we have lead actors, they don't quite look like lead American actors. I had that image of the American hero, I suppose, in my head automatically. And see Douglas Hodge, who's not ugly by any means or anything like that. Or you know what I mean, though, don't you? It's like Doctor Who, you know what I mean?
If you're listening, Douglas.
Yeah, sorry, Douglas. but he's got like a rugby player look about him. I think he's got that, but he is really good in the role. I enjoyed his performance. It was just the 2 female leads that didn't quite match up with him when they worked alongside him, which was a shame.
Yeah, I'd kind of disagree a little bit. 'Cause I am a big fan of Sylvester Letouzeux as his ex-wife, Joanna Ball. I've seen her in loads of stuff. I quite like her character. I think she gets most of the funny line. I was actually surprised how funny it is in places. There's some quite nice, witty exchanges.
Oh, well, I agree with you, Gareth. I've seen her in many things and enjoyed her performance. It was in this one. I didn't enjoy her performance in this, but I agree with what you were saying about the dialogue. And it wasn't just her. I don't know if you noticed it, because I've made a note to it here that particularly if it's any sort of introduction or 2 characters coming together in a new scene, it seems to start with some humorous line before getting on with the story. And it was every scene, it didn't matter what the actors were. Admittedly, they were more noticeable with Joanna's character, but every character seemed to have those little wisdoms at the beginning of a new scene, which I thought was quite interesting. But I always think comedy does work well in a thriller horror. If you can start with comedy, you buy the audience's attention more, and then when you hit them with the thrills or the scares or whatever, I think it has a bigger impact.
That's true. I can think of one example, like you said, Nicky, when Steve first goes to London to see Joanna, he has that witty exchange with the newspaper seller on the street corner.
Yeah.
So you're right. There is a lot of humour in it. I think that's a British thing.
It is, because it's quite sort of Hitchcockian in some ways, that kind of mixing up humour and drama. And in some ways, this is it's a man on the run story to some extent. But certainly going back to your earlier point, Nicky, I think I'd agree with one of the weaker aspects of this is the romance between Steve and Melissa. It seems mostly to happen because they're the 2 leads, really, more than anything else.
Now, if it were a longer series and they were doing it and it were a case of they've gone through all this mishap together and then they become a couple, it makes sense. But in that very short time frame, it just feels forced. We didn't actually talk about the writer in any...
We didn't, and we ought to. How do you feel about Peter Boker?
Well, it isn't a name that stuck out to me, even when I actually watched the show, shamefully enough, because as you mentioned in the opening for this show, he wrote Eric and Ernie, which I was in.
You were? Were
I,
you Eric or Ernie?
no, 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 no. I was only an extra in multiple scenes, and I got to be with Victoria Wood, which was quite interesting. But in terms of this and looking him up in IMDb, it's quite interesting that prior to The Uninvited, he mainly wrote dramas like Peak Practice and Casualty. So I can understand why he lent himself well to writing this for ITV and sort of, that Morse, because even though that we talked about the white, we talked about the aliens have white eyes. That is the only visible alien thing about them. It could just be take the alien element out and still do it. It could just be like a government conspiracy or a secret organization or whatever.
Yeah, I like to think that the reason that Zentex was dominating the computer industry is because it had some kind of alien. They were using their knowledge, to make the best possible computers and thus monopolize the market.
Because they do, don't they? They shut everything down.
Yeah.
Sorry, carry on. Carry on.
I do find it interesting that afterwards he doesn't seem to dip his toe back in the sci-fi pool again.
No.
Even though he has great success with he did Blackpool, for example, and the A Word and stuff like that. So he has some great writing credits to his name. But obviously sci-fi is not something he wants to return to.
It's funny, in that TV Zone article, it says that Peter Barker went off and read the Midwich Cuckoos and other things like it. So he really must have got into the mood, as you say. But yeah, maybe he just didn't have aspirations for science fiction, but they chose him because of his reputation for drama.
I think that was the case. I think they say they thought he was very good at writing characters and relationships, which certainly is a theme when you look through, as Dick was saying. I mean, you could argue Blackpool has a certain fantastical element to it.
Is that magical realism?
Yeah, it's more magical realism going on in there, as much as any musical is. Yes. I mean, it's obviously its template is more Dennis Potter than any kind of fantasy series. But yeah, he's gone on to have a very creditable career. With one thing, I watched this with my partner Tina, and she made the comment that this feels like a Midsummer Murder. And one thing, and certainly looking at it, I was kind of thinking, this feels so much like an ITV murder mystery.
Well, it's rural England, isn't it? I suppose that's.
I don't think it's just that. I think it's the way it's filmed. I mean, when he first started, bear in mind I'd not seen it the first time round. Even though I would have watched stuff like that when I was 11, so I don't know why I missed it. But anyway, when he first started. After the little bit with Blake, and you see the guy in the posh car listening to classical music, it was like watching an episode of Morse. I was expecting John Thor to be in that car.
It does have that feel, definitely.
90s ITV sort of cop drama, which is immediately recognisable, I think.
I suppose that's why they did that, because that's what sold at the time. That was the formula, so to speak, if you wanted to be on TV. And I don't know if we're skipping ahead yet to 90s TV being embarrassed to do sci-fi, but you're right, that's how it looks and feels to get in the casual viewer.
I think there's definitely a case of that I think this is a kind of science fiction they feel that they could sell, because it's packaged so much like any of those like Morse or the Ruth Rendell Mysteries or any of those kind of Sunday night dramas. It has definitely got that look to it. It's also, another striking thing about it is that it's very going back to what we were saying about working class and middle class, it feels very middle class in terms of there's only one person doesn't have a nice detached house in this, and he has a specific story reason for not having a nice detached house, but everybody else has got lovely houses in this series. All the interiors are like straight out of an interior design magazine. Everything looks very polished.
It was all filmed around Norfolk. I mean, there must have been some element of like trying to sell it to America as well, and so show off the countryside.
That's a good point. Yeah, there probably is that sense of, yes, internationally, this is what Britain looks like. It's nice, polite people who live in sort of like pleasant surroundings, or very trendy surroundings. In the case of Joanna,
of course, she's a high-ranking newspaper editor or something, isn't she?
So naturally, she has what looks like, I don't know if it's a breakfast bar or her kitchen that's kind of in this raised podium in the middle of her apartment.
She's probably got an apartment in the Docklands, hasn't she? It
has that kind of Docklands, that sort of Bugs look to it, where it's all shiny and which I suppose is another sort of bit of coding of saying. Whereas Melissa, it's all sort of cardigans and rural and countryside, whereas Joanna, it's all sharp suits, lots of chrome urban living to show a difference in their characters.
I think as well, maybe I'm jumping the gun a bit as well, but when I mentioned about the guy in the car listening to classical music, the music in general, at first you think it has a very 90s typical, slightly sound to it, with that sort of, those harsh sounds. But when you listen carefully to the music, it's got these beautiful orchestral bits and a bit of choir type stuff, which I quite liked. But I did find it was quite repetitive. It did feel like that. One of those things where they just create one sound and then it's repeated throughout the entire thing. But it was a lovely piece of music.
Just agree with you, Nikki. It is very good, very haunting. But you're right, it's almost like they wrote 3 pieces and then just reused them constantly.
You took the words out of my mouth. Martin Kiszko, who wrote the music, did a splendid job. That's that lovely choral, sort of alien type one. Sinister strings going under it. The bum 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 bum. And yeah, it's a lovely piece, but boy, you do hear it a lot.
They released a soundtrack. I'm curious to know how long it was and what's on it.
Well, there's only 3 bits of music. What do they put on it? Just slightly different tempos of music of those 3 themes.
Although Gareth, I'm sorry if it sounds sacrilegious, but that's almost what we did with Robin of Sherwood.
Oh no, I'm going to defend. Robin Legend by Clannad. No, there are very distinct. Those are 10 very distinct tracks.
Of course, I love Clannad's music for that series, but it's just battle is used in every episode,
But I agree. Yeah, there are certain bits that they use. Yeah, you're going to hear battle during the fight scenes. You're going to hear Marion's
theme, Robin's theme, Hearn's theme. So it's an old trope. But
it's more noticeable in this because there's only 4 episodes.
Of course it is.
And especially when you're watching them in close, fairly quickly after the other. Yeah, inevitably when this came out in 1997, it was described as a British X-Files. And there's no doubt the X-Files had a huge influence on 90s science fiction.
Definitely.
So how do you think this sort of compares? Because that's obviously the show that they're sort of looking at.
It's not even close.
No.
Obviously it's just advertising buzzwords, really, isn't it?
Yeah, spiritually they're very different sorts of shows because whereas the X-Files, apart from the fact the X-Files is largely takes place at night, it seems, or generally in moody, foggy places. X-Files has a sort of general paranoia about the whole world and everybody, and whereas this is a very specific plan. There's no suggestion really that all of the British government has been taken over by the aliens. It's just a small column, a fifth column within the establishment.
Exactly. But I think we can, or at least I can, forgive that because, you want to promote and sell your series, attach it to the nearest star, more or less, But I don't know if people were disappointed. I don't remember what the viewing figures might have been like at the time.
I must admit, I haven't looked at the viewing figures. I haven't really talked about viewing figures, really.
Because, I mean, some of us remember watching it, but, others, it's not without merit, the series. It's just kind of just forgotten.
Yeah, I think spiritually. Sorry, Nick.
I was just going to say a purposeful pun. They couldn't have got that high enough because it wasn't renewed.
They weren't invited to do a second series.
They weren't invited.
Although it had a proper ending anyway, didn't it? But
that's it. I mean,
although not in the book, interestingly. I think it's in the book they have that extra scene at the end, don't they? Where there's one that survived.
Oh yeah, the little boy, because presumably his body's different or something. Even though he's still a copy and an alien. You're right. There's that little.
And they say he feels like he's getting messages from somewhere up above, as if
the others,
he's still connected to the aliens that are or creatures that are in somewhere else.
Yes.
So yeah.
Well, that is really interesting. And now you've raised it, I think we'll move on to the novelization by Paul Cornell.
It's felt very well written. I mean, I'm a fan of his from reading his Doctor Who New Adventures and a couple of his original science fiction novels that came from the success of that. It's well written. He just gives some background to the characters and situations. Like I said earlier about, the human bodies are copies with the human memories there and personality, but it's an alien intelligence in control, and the creatures are some kind of gaseous entity. That's how we can enter these copied bodies or control things, And like Nikki said, he tries to justify or explain why Joanna's so harsh, So it's good as a book on its own, but having read it directly after rewatching the series, it just felt like I was just going through the same story again.
Yeah,
but I'm sure if I left a longer gap, then I probably would appreciate it more.
It didn't miss a beat, did it? Really, in terms of it felt like you were watching the show. I think the interesting elements were the internal thoughts of the characters. Because
that worked.
You don't get them on the screen, and I'd be interested to know where he derived some of it from in terms of did he ask Peter Bowker?
Yeah, exactly.
Because that's what I was hoping from the book. I was hoping to get that I felt was missing from the series, but I don't think it completely satisfied me to how I wanted it. But it's very much, if you want a novelization of a TV program. That's what you've got. He's covered everything. You would have thought you'd watched it by the end.
Of course. Oh, and of course the obligatory colour photo section in the middle.
Yes. Which were a bit of a. I don't know about you, but I think we're a bit of a spoiler because the last image is the one of Leslie Grantham, and it looks like he's dead.
It is. It's from that last scene. You're right.
Yeah. So, like, if you saw, I mean, you could assume that maybe he's just injured. Maybe if you look back. But if I had read that book and seen that picture, I thought, oh, so he dies at the end.
It covers everything. It shows all the leads. There's some nice photographs.
I'm quite fond of. I went through a phase. I used to be really into novelizations. I sort of collected every novelization, especially of anything that was a sort of sci-fi film.
Yeah,
I could get behind. So, and most of them did have that nice little 8-page
Yes.
section in them. I remember being quite fond of those. And in fact, I think it might be interesting to talk about sort of British sci-fi in the 90s. Well, British TV
Yes.
sci-fi, to be specific.
Of course,
You almost want to
yes.
say what British TV sci-fi in the 90s, but it
It-
seemed
it-
to be always be kids television that still did sci-fi, and very good sci-fi, to be fair.
I made a list, Gareth.
All right, let's have a hear.
So
hear
the
of
ones
it.
I remember and will have watched at the time, right? So we've got Crime Traveller 97, forget that. But we got Bugs from 95. And that lasted 4 years and almost didn't get a fourth year. Now Bugs, that was what was that? That was a kind of, I know we got Brian Clemens involved to try and say, look, it's kind of Avengers-ish. We'll try and get that tone, but again, it was a very 90s thing, wasn't it? And then you've got The Uninvited, of course. And then you've got Invasion Earth, which
Oh yes.
really did play down in all the interviews with the cast and the crew the sci-fi elements and say, look, it's realistic, because as you said, they became embarrassed. All the TV stations, it all comes from them wanting Doctor Who to compete with Star Trek or Star Wars, and that just permeated into TV execs working on all channels, didn't it?
It's true. It did seem to affect. I think possibly what happened is you had a lot of TV execs who'd grown up or were teenagers in that kind of 70s, 80s, and they kind of, in their mind, they thought science fiction still looked like that, or at least British science fiction. It was
The wobbly walls and stuff.
the classic,
Rubber
the wobbly
monsters.
walls. It's all a bit embarrassing and sort of hammy, and we're doing prestige sort of
Exactly, film drama.
to some extent. I mean, it comes out in that interview that you quoted earlier. Leslie Grantham says, we're making what I hope is a decent B movie.
Exactly. At
Sorry,
least they're admitting the sci-fi anyway.
That is something. I mean, to be honest, I actually agree with Leslie Grantham on this one. This is quite a B movie sort of plot in some, although they've dressed it up to look like a nice prestige ITV crime series. It's a fairly B movie style plot.
Yes.
I would agree, about aliens taking over humans and the one hero that nobody believes. We've seen this story, quite a bit over the years in various films. But there was a general sense that science fiction was something that wasn't popular, that was very niche, which seems very strange actually when science fiction became huge. And I think a lot of the interesting television science fiction in the 90s is happening in America.
Yes,
unfortunately.
that was it. They kept thinking we've got to compete with American imports.
To some extent, yeah. So, I mean, even Doctor Who, it's a case of, we'll go and we'll do a deal with an American TV studio and so make sure that Doctor Who looks like an American show. Sorry. No, carry on, Nicky. I've been waffling for a while.
So I was going to say I have a bit of a different take on it because obviously I'm a bit younger, but me now and then off. Cut that. We'll start again. I have a different take on it because growing up in the 90s, I didn't feel. For me, there wasn't a lack of sci-fi because I think a lot of it was in children's television. I think CITV and the BBC were still making, and not even just sci-fi in a very cartoony way, but they're quite gritty stuff. And also we were getting Australian, New Zealand imports of a similar ilk, and then a few Americans as stuff as well, like Animorphs and so on and so forth. So I think from a child in the 90s, I think you didn't really lose that science fiction element.
What did we have in children's TV? Was Dark Season was the 90s?
Yes, that's correct, yeah.
I would agree that actually children's ITV had some of the most interesting British contributions.
When did we do the Tomorrow People?
That was that 95, wasn't it?
That was, yes, that was 90s. There was Aliens and Family.
Yes. There was some lesser good ones, even though the last flight, because the other night I couldn't sleep and I ended up going down a wormhole on the internet, looking up Mike and Angelo, which was a
Oh,
yes. CITV alien comedy, but it lasted for 11 years.
What on Earth as well?
Oh yeah, What on Earth?
And it was weird. They were trying to get an American audience because they always had it that the child in it was American and come over to the UK.
I never watched enough. Wow.
So it was quite weird. But yeah, there were a lot of it about in children's television. It was just when you look back, and certainly when I looked back for this program, I realised there weren't much. I think it's mid-90s when Britain starts dipping its toe. I think that's probably because, you'd had the success of the X-Files, but then you were having success of things like more fantasy series like Buffy and stuff. And because that's Jerry coming over here and being popular and shown on BBC and what have you, I think they thought, well, we can start doing that type of stuff now.
During the 90s, I think a lot of science fiction, like The Uninvited, it kind of gets dressed up as something else. You had, there was Firstborn.
Yes, I remember that.
It is a science fiction. It is very near future. I think it still qualifies as science fiction because it's dealing with genetic engineering. They're trying to play it as realistically as possible.
Was that the Stephen Gallagher one? No, Chimera and October later on as well.
I'm not sure if October was noughties. I could be wrong there.
I think it was late 90s.
Well, another one I was thinking about, which is still one of my favourites, even though it only ever did one series, was Ultraviolet from 1998.
I loved that. I loved Ultraviolet.
Oh, yeah.
I still class it as a science fiction show because even though it was clearly trying to build on the Buffy success, we've been about vampires, the whole stories in it were science fiction. It was and it was brilliant, well acted, everything about it. But for whatever reason, it didn't last, unfortunately.
Channel 4 weren't interested in recommissioning it, unfortunately.
Which is a shame.
And that seems, it seemed amazing. I remember at the time, Ultraviolet seemed really like it was going to be the beginning of a new sort of like a generation of British telefantasy, because it did. It looked like it had learned a lot of lessons from America and combined it with the best of what we British do in our grit, in our it really worked well.
I'm trying to remember. It took the scientific approach to vampirism. So their guns had video cameras on and screens, so if they didn't see somebody on the screen, that meant they were a vampire. And the bullets had like carbon heads on it, so that's the equivalent of using a stake on them. But also, wasn't the plot that the vampires were going to pollute the earth to make it uninhabitable for humans?
That's right.
And they're going to keep some humans as a food stock.
I think that we might well return to Ultraviolet in a future episode. I think.
No, my number, Gareth.
Fair. You're at the top of the list. Talk about Ultraviolet, definitely. I think we're coming round to the sort of wrapping up stage. I think talking about Ultraviolet, and so I think I shall turn to you, Nikki, first. And would you like to look at some closing thoughts, some summings up of what you feel about The Uninvited?
I think it's definitely worth a watch. Don't expect it to be amazing because it isn't, and it's stuff you've definitely seen before, but there's some real interesting elements in that you don't get in those other series.
I think I mostly remembered what had happened, and it's not unmemorable. And like Nikki said, it's worth a watch, but I wouldn't say, I don't think it's developed a cult following like some one-off series have. It's worth watching. It's well acted, and it's well put together. And and it's an attempt to actually say, yes, we are science fiction, to the point where there's a chase in a quarry. So it's legitimately science fiction, but it just slightly misses the mark somehow, and I don't know why. Maybe it is because, as you say, we're going for that 90s drama formula to make it acceptable to a mainstream audience. It's good, but it won't change your life.
I think I would agree with you. I was struck watching it again how watchable it is. But yeah, its main problem is in that TV Zone article, even the makers are kind of listing all the things that it's similar to, like the Invaders and
Midwich Cuckoo.
Midwich Cuckoos. So on one level, it's very watchable. It does play it very safe. It's got some nice touches in it. We haven't really mentioned the white eyes in the end. I do think the white eyes. I think the white eyes are a great effect, and those moments when someone's eyes suddenly kind of flash white for a moment, it's quite an unsettling effect. It works very well. And, we didn't need the sticky out fingers in the end.
The white eyes stood out enough for Leslie Grantham face to be all over the merchandise, so to speak, and publicity.
It didn't get a cult following because there's nothing distinctive about it, either as an ITV thriller or as a British science fiction series.
We need to start a fan club now. We need an appreciation society for the uninvited, don't we?
I'll build a website.
Well, this has been a lot of fun. Thank you very much to my guests, Nikki Smalley and John Isles, for taking the time to talk about The Uninvited.
Thanks for having me, Gareth.
Yes, thank you for inviting me to talk about The Uninvited.
Thanks a lot. And thank you for listening as well. Look forward to talking to you again soon. Goodbye. You've been listening to Very British Futures, where Nikki Smalley, John Isles and myself have been talking about The Uninvited. Music by Chattery Art. Produced by Gareth Preston. Follow us on Twitter at FuturesVery and find out more at garethpreston.blog. Next time we'll be taking a look at Max Headroom.